Prologue. She found it hard to breathe as she ran, her nightgown soaked from the rain, clinging to her tiny frame the way a sheet of newspaper clings to the wet surface of a city street. Branches and thorns cut into her face, ankles, and arms as she trampled through the tangled undergrowth and sapling trees. Deviating from the red rock path, she had chosen thorn patches and prickly limbs over immediate death. She could hear them behind her, thrashing and cutting their way through the brush. Angry, bad-tempered creatures of hate and darkness, they roared in fury at their prey's defiance against them, their fury filled by giving chase to such a fragile old woman. That, however, would not change her course, nor would it instill in her the need to give in, to give up so that they could ravage and desecrate her remains. She may be old, perhaps, but weak-willed and subservient. No. If they were to overcome her and tear her apart, they would have to earn that right. Until that moment, she had no intention of stopping, no matter how bad it hurt to breathe or how treacherous the ground beneath her feet had become. A fusillade of explosions tore across the heavens as flashes of light brighter than a midday sun illuminated the world around her. In those brief instances of light, she spied glimpses of the beasts hunting her. They were closer now, much closer than she had thought. The tangles of weeds and limbs had slowed them some, but apparently not enough as they were closing the distance at a fair speed. A tarnished silver pendant in the shape of a dolphin and affixed to a rusted chain dangled between the fingers of her right hand. She raised it to her lips, praying silently and reaching out her left hand to grab hold of a young oak. This was the point where the old road had cut through the property some 100 years before, the road that had led to the Atkins home place. She cast a look over her shoulder as she ascended the small bank, holding on to the sapling oak with a firm grip and careful not to slip on the mud and dead leaves. They were still coming. Forcing her way through an even denser thicket of blackberry bushes and pines, she pushed onward. The woods here had always been wild and untamed, at least as far back as she could remember, but never had she noticed so many of the smaller trees and bushes that were now causing her so much grief. If her husband were still alive, it wouldn't be like this. He would have had it all cut back into neat little paths and trails. This had been his turf. Out here amongst the trees had been his never-never land, but that was no more. For almost 11 years now, and for eternity, he was gone and she was alone. She hated being alone. She hated having to face these devils. She hated not knowing what to do. Worst yet, she hated herself for being so weak. Her husband had been strong and always knew exactly how to handle things. Oh, how she missed him and wished that he were here now. He had always believed in her strong will, even her tendency to be hard-headed at times. "Liz, you're the most pig-headed, stubborn woman I've ever laid eyes on," he used to say. "But by God, I wouldn't trade you for all the gold in Fort Knox." Oh, how she missed him. She was reaching up to wipe a lock of gray hair from her eyes when she fell, slipping on a slick bed of pine needles and landing on her back. For a moment, she lay there with the rain pecking her face, her back and legs quivering in pain, and then she slowly stood up, using the base of an aging poplar tree for support. A loud metallic shriek echoed around her, followed by another, then another, until the stormy night was alive with the twisting metal shrieks of them. You could hear the anger, the hunger, the frenzied longing for the kill in those mad cries. Leaning against the knotted old poplar in the pouring rain, hitching in breath after breath with the unholy wails of the damned skirting the shadows, a refreshed determination shone in her teary eyes. "I am not weak," she sobbed and let go of the tree. Taking a step forward, wincing from the pain in her legs, she cast one more glance behind her. "I am not weak," she shouted into the darkness. "Do you hear that? I am not weak." "Nor are we, bitch," 1,000 voices at once, discontent and irate, screaming at her in 1,000 tongues. Thunder rolled and lightning struck across the night, and she moved forward. Not yet defeated, and filled with an anger of her own, she was unwavering in her decision to evade her hunters and to make it to the safety of her house. Slapping the branches out of her way and mindful of the dead leaves, slick pine needle beds, and exposed roots of trees, and the not-too-distant memory of her spill to the sodden ground, she held high her goals to make it to her house and through the front door, shutting out the madness behind her. Her lungs were not used to such strains, and her heart, lazy and frail thing that it was beating a bass drum solo in her chest. She hadn't had this much exercise in several long years, and on a normal day would have no exercise at all, other than tending her flower beds or weeding out the vegetable garden behind the house. "Lord, lend me the strength to go on," she prayed silently. "Lend me the will to survive this nightmare." In the distance, dim amber light seeped through a break in the tree line. It was the floodlight at the end of her driveway. She was no more than 20, maybe 30 feet at most from her front yard. Limping a little on her left leg and gritting her teeth with each step, she hurried on, using the occasional oak or pine to keep from falling flat on her face. In her hurry to be free of her pursuers, she nearly tripped and fell over the rusted frame of a child's tricycle that jutted from the mulched woodland floor like the skeletal corpse of some tiny, discarded robot. A rotted old string hung from one mildewed white rubber hand grip with a tiny G.I. Joe action figure hanging on the end of it like an Old West cowboy hanging from a noose. Unlike the tricycle and the string, the G.I. Joe seemed to be unaffected by age or the elements. How strange was that? "Look at him go, Liz," her husband's voice, happy and content as they stood on their front porch watching their 5-year-old son pedal his little trike across the yard, dodging and weaving between young dogwood trees like a test driver maneuvering through the orange rubber cones on a test track. "He'll be riding a regular-sized bike before long. Damn, look at him go." He had grabbed her around the waist and hugged her tight, then planted a kiss on her cheek. "That boy's growing so damn fast." He had then turned and called out to their son, "Give it hell, boy! By God, give it all you got!" And he had laughed that deep, joyful laugh that had been an Ernest Sanders trademark. Fresh tears mingled with the rain streaming over her cheeks, and for a moment she thought she would drop to her knees and weep. Then, to her left sounded a loud snap and pop of breaking limbs and a rustle of brush. As vivid and as pleasant as it was, the memory of her husband and son had lulled her into a false sense of well-being. They were almost right on top of her, and she could linger no longer, lest she meet her maker at the tips of their razor-sharp claws. Calling on what little strength she had left, she bolted through the last wall of vines and thorn bushes and out onto the red rock driveway, refusing to let her aching legs buckle and send her sprawling to the ground. She was running hard now, the tarnished dolphin pendant bouncing and swinging from her clenched fist and pushing her body as much as it would allow her to push it. The outside light above her front door became a beacon for her salvation, and suddenly she felt no pain, only relief and hope. Her nightgown was nothing more now than filthy, tattered rags, and her arms, legs, and neck a network of bruises and cuts. But she took notice of none of this. She would soon be in her house with the doors locked and the furnace set as high as it would go. Then nothing of this would truly matter, not in one little bit, and all her fears and regrets would smother underneath her pillow as she dozed off to sleep. Behind her, they burst into the clearing, growling and barking, filling the night with their inhuman rage. She wanted to look back, to see them, to see how far or close they might be, but she didn't dare. It would be like a person terrified of heights looking down from atop a very high place. It would heighten her fear and cause her to make a crucial mistake. "Don't let them get you, Mama." It was her son's voice, not as he was now, a grown man, but the voice of her son as a scared 6-year-old boy. "Them is mean old monsters hiding in the woods. Don't let them get you, Mama." Get you, not get me, which is what he had said back when he was so little and still needed his mother. "Mama's coming, baby. I won't let them get at you," she said, breaking out of her dash to safety and falling into a lumbering stagger. "I promise." "You ain't going much anywhere, Lizzie." She looked up and saw his hulking shadow between 2 dogwood trees, as menacing a form as any horror story monster. "I'll tell you what, though. You gave us one hell of a run. By damn if you didn't. But it's all over now, old girl. I reckon you ain't got nowhere else to run." Slimy, rotting fingers wrapped around her arms. Something cold and bristly nudged her neck, and she screamed. From the shadows over the pouring rain and thunder, she heard them laughing. The phone on his nightstand was ringing, but it was as far away to him as an uncharted galaxy. At last, he opened his eyes and looked over at his alarm clock. Bright yellow numbers stared back at him. "Who in the hell's calling at 3 in the damn morning?" he thought, fumbling for the phone and succeeding only in knocking it out of its base and onto the floor. Damn it! He reached down and picked up the phone, thumbing the talk button and pressing it to his ear. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was tired and frightened. "Ray? This is Roy. Hate to wake you, cuz, but it's about your mom. You need to come home just as soon as you can." "What about my mom?" Ray Sanders asked, sitting up and swinging his legs over the edge of the bed. Concern for his mother replaced all thoughts of returning to sleep. "What's happened, Roy?" Damn, man, I hate to be the one to tell you this." "Just say it," Ray shot back. "Just tell me what's happened." "Your mom, she called us about 2 or 3 hours ago, said she had a really bad scare from a bad dream and that her chest was hurting. Dad and me went over and got her over to the hospital, but it was no good, Ray. We were too late and... There was crying on the other end of the line, then an older, deep baritone voice. "You still there, Ray?" It was his Uncle James, who sounded as if he had done his own share of crying. "I'm here," Ray said, dreamy and far away, afraid of this conversation, praying that it would end and afraid of where it was heading. He did not want to hear what his uncle was about to say, not in the least. "You're dreaming. You know that, don't you?" But he wasn't. "Your mom, she passed, son. It was a heart attack. That's what Doc Holden says. I am so sorry. With your dad gone and all, I know this is... I'll be home tomorrow. I'll tend to things." "All right," his uncle replied. "That's best, I imagine, but you be careful on the drive up. If you're not going to be able to hold up to it, me or Roy could come down to Panama City and pick you up, or you could take a bus." No, I'll be okay. Be a waste of gas and time for one of you to drive down here, and buses take way too long." "Well, okay, but mind me and be careful now. Don't go speeding down the interstate and get yourself killed. We'll hold things down here until you get here." Ray started to say something about how ironic it would be if he were to die in a car wreck rushing home to bury his mother, but instead he said, "Thank you, Uncle James. I'm glad you and Roy were with her. I feel better knowing someone in the family was there." They said their goodbyes, and Ray pressed the end button on his phone and tossed it across the room. There was a loud crash as it smashed against the wall, and Ray dropped his face into his upturned palms. He stayed like that for several minutes before getting up and crossing over to the bathroom to get dressed. He made it as far as the bathroom door before he broke into tears.